Welcome back to Old State Valuable Coins. Today, we're taking a closer look at an intriguing piece of American history, the 1981 D Washington Quarter. This coin may look like ordinary pocket change, but its history, condition, rarity, and potential collector value make it worth a much closer look. So stay with us as we uncover the story behind this fascinating quarter and discover what could make a seemingly simple 25-cent coin much more valuable to collectors. Let's get started. First up into the imagine finding a 1981 D Washington Quarter in an old collection. A coin that at first looks like nothing more than an ordinary 25-cent piece from the early 1980s. Now look at that small letter D beside George Washington's portrait and consider what this coin actually represents. The 1981 D Washington Quarter was struck at the Denver Mint during one of the most turbulent economic periods in modern American history. When inflation was eating away at purchasing power, interest rates were reaching extraordinary levels, unemployment was rising, and a newly elected president was promising to fundamentally change the direction of the American economy. This was the America of Ronald Reagan's first year in office, an America still dealing with the economic problems of the late 1970s while simultaneously entering a new political era. The coin itself was produced in enormous numbers, with an official mintage of 575,722,833 pieces, so the ordinary 1981 D Quarter is not genuinely rare simply because of its date and mint mark. But that enormous production figure makes the surviving high-grade examples even more interesting. The overwhelming majority of these quarters were made to circulate, not to become collectibles. They were intended for ordinary Americans to spend at grocery stores, restaurants, gas stations, vending machines, parking meters, laundromats, and countless other everyday transactions. Over 4 decades later, collectors can separate those ordinary survivors from exceptionally preserved examples, and that is where the real story of the 1981 D begins. A coin produced by the hundreds of millions can still become surprisingly desirable when only a small fraction survive with pristine surfaces, strong luster, sharp details, and an elite professional grade. To understand why the United States Mint needed to produce a quarter like this, we have to go back to the transformation of American coinage itself. The Washington Quarter had already been part of American life for generations. John Flanagan's Washington portrait had become instantly recognizable, and by 1981, the design had been adapted to the modern clad coinage system that replaced the traditional silver composition for regular circulation quarters after 1964. The 1981 D was a copper-nickel clad quarter, with an outer layer composed of 75% copper and 25% nickel surrounding a pure copper center. It measured approximately 24.3 millimeters across and weighed 5.67 grams with a reeded edge. The D mint mark identified Denver as the production facility, and the coin carried the familiar Washington portrait on the obverse and the eagle design on the reverse. But the reason for producing hundreds of millions of these pieces was not to create a numismatic rarity. The purpose was economic practicality. A modern industrial economy needed a dependable supply of small denomination coins moving continuously through commerce. The quarter was especially useful because 25 cents represented a meaningful but convenient unit of spending. It could operate machines, pay for services, complete purchases, provide change, and move rapidly between consumers and businesses. Every day, millions of Americans interacted with coins without thinking about the manufacturing process behind them. At the Denver Mint, however, these pieces were being produced through an enormous industrial operation in which blank planchets were prepared, dies transferred the design under tremendous pressure, and finished coins were inspected, counted, packaged, and distributed into the national monetary system. The result was a quarter that looked ordinary because its entire purpose was to be ordinary. But the year 1981 gives this particular quarter a historical atmosphere that goes far beyond its denomination. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in January 1981, the American economy was under extraordinary pressure. Inflation had already reached double-digit levels, interest rates were painfully high, unemployment was affecting millions of people, and Americans were increasingly concerned that their wages were failing to keep pace with rising prices. Reagan's administration presented a major economic program built around reducing taxes, controlling federal spending, easing regulation, and encouraging private sector growth. In February 1981, Reagan described the economic situation as an exceptionally serious national problem, pointing to inflation, unemployment, high mortgage rates, and the declining purchasing power of money. The Federal Reserve under Chairman Paul Volcker was simultaneously pursuing a restrictive monetary policy designed to defeat inflation, even though that strategy would impose severe short-term economic pain. The federal funds rate approached 20%, while borrowing became extremely expensive for households and businesses. The economy officially entered the 1981-1982 recession in the third quarter of 1981, with unemployment subsequently climbing sharply as high interest rates put pressure on industries such as construction and manufacturing. So while the Denver Mint was producing the 1981 D quarter, America was entering an economic struggle that would affect everything from home buying and automobile production to business investment and household budgets. The quarter was therefore being manufactured during a moment when the value of money itself had become a national concern. Americans were not simply asking how much they earned, they were asking what that money would actually buy. And that brings us back to the coin sitting in front of you. The 1981 D Washington quarter is fascinating precisely because it was never supposed to be a famous rarity. It was created to serve the American economy at a moment when the country was struggling with inflation, high interest rates, unemployment, political change, Cold War tensions, and a rapidly evolving technological landscape. More than $500 million were struck in Denver, and countless examples entered circulation where they were handled, scratched, worn, and eventually forgotten. Some disappeared into jars and drawers. Some were saved by collectors. A much smaller number survived with the kind of preservation that modern grading services recognize as genuinely exceptional. Today, PCGS's survival estimates suggest that millions remain in mint state, but the finest levels are considerably more competitive, and the condition census reaches MS67. That means the most exciting discovery is not simply seeing the date 1981 and the D mint mark. The real opportunity is finding an example that looks dramatically better than the typical coin of its generation. Examine the fields around Washington carefully. Look at the cheek and hair for contact marks. Study the lettering and rims. Turn the coin over and inspect the eagle, the surrounding fields, and the highest points of the design. Pay attention to luster and original surfaces, because harsh cleaning can destroy the qualities collectors value most. If you discover a coin that appears unusually sharp and clean, professional grading may be worth considering before assuming its value. And if you encounter an unusual feature, do not immediately call it a mint error. Compare it with authenticated examples and have it evaluated when necessary. The 1981 D Washington quarter teaches one of the most important lessons in coin collecting. A huge mintage does not prevent a coin from having valuable elite examples, but it also does not make every old-looking specimen rare. Its true story is one of survival. Hundreds of millions began the journey, millions remain today, and only a fraction possess the combination of preservation, strike quality, originality, and market appeal that can make collectors compete for them. More than 40 years after it left the Denver Mint, this small quarter has become a physical time capsule of 1981 America, a year when the country was fighting inflation, entering recession, beginning a new political chapter, and looking toward an uncertain future. Most 1981 D quarters will always be ordinary money, but the exceptional survivors remind us that sometimes the greatest numismatic stories are not about coins that were born rare. They are about ordinary coins that survived extraordinarily well. Next up into the take, a close look at the 1985 P Washington quarter, because this small piece of clad metal carries us directly into one of the most fascinating periods of modern American history. At first glance, there seems to be nothing extraordinary about it. The familiar portrait of George Washington is on the obverse, the eagle appears on the reverse, and the small P mint mark tells us that this quarter was struck at the Philadelphia Mint. But behind that ordinary appearance is the story of an America that was changing rapidly. The 1985 P quarter was produced during Ronald Reagan's second presidential term, at a time when the country was emerging from the painful recession of the early 1980s and experiencing a powerful economic recovery. Inflation had fallen dramatically compared with the crisis years at the beginning of the decade. Employment was expanding, interest rates were declining, American industries were modernizing, and personal computers and other new technologies were beginning to reshape everyday life. At the same time, the United States remained deeply involved in the Cold War, international tensions remained high, and political debates over taxes, government spending, defense, trade, and the proper size of government were defining national life. In that environment, the quarter continued doing something remarkably simple. It moved through the American economy. Millions of people used quarters every day without giving any thought to the story behind them. The 1985 P was manufactured for commerce, not for collectors, and the Philadelphia Mint produced 775,818,962 examples, an enormous quantity that immediately tells us that an ordinary 1985 P quarter is not rare merely because of its date and P mint mark. Yet this is where the story becomes much more interesting. PCGS estimates that approximately 271.5 million examples survive in all grades, about 81.5 million survive at mint state 60 or better, and roughly 16.3 million survive at mint state 65 or better. Those numbers make the overall issue common, but they also reveal why the highest grades can become surprisingly difficult to locate. The 1985 P is a perfect example of how a coin can be common in circulation while becoming scarce at the very top of the grading scale. To understand why the United States Mint was producing so many Washington quarters in 1985, we need to go back to the origins of the denomination and the transformation of American coinage. The Washington quarter had begun in 1932, originally created to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth, and John Flanagan's portrait soon became one of the most recognizable images in American money. By 1985, however, this was no longer the silver quarter that earlier generations remembered. Rising silver prices and monetary pressures had already led the United States Mint to replace the traditional silver composition of regular circulating quarters with copper-nickel-clad metal beginning in 1965. The 1985 P therefore belonged to the modern clad era. It was approximately 24.3 millimeters in diameter, weighed 5.67 grams, and consisted of a copper-nickel outer layer surrounding a pure copper core with the familiar reeded edge. The design was the product of an earlier generation, but the coin itself belonged completely to modern America. Its purpose was practical. A quarter was one of the most useful small denominations in the American monetary system. It could pay for a vending machine purchase, provide change at a store, help pay for parking, operate a laundromat machine, contribute toward a telephone call, or simply remain in someone's pocket until the next transaction. Businesses needed dependable supplies of quarters, banks needed bags and rolls of them, and the mint had to manufacture enough pieces to keep the national economy functioning smoothly. This was not a coin designed to sit untouched inside a display case. It was an industrial product created for circulation. At the Philadelphia Mint, planchets were fed into a massive production process in which dies struck Washington's portrait and the reverse design into the metal with tremendous force. Newly struck pieces were counted, inspected, packaged, and distributed into commerce. The ordinary citizen rarely saw any of this. To the public, the quarter simply appeared as change. But every 1985 P quarter represented the combination of American engineering, industrial production, monetary policy, transportation, banking, and everyday commerce that kept the nation's coinage system functioning. That is what makes the coin historically meaningful, even when its monetary value is only 25 cents. The value story follows the same pattern. A normal circulated 1985 P Washington quarter is generally worth little more than its face value because of the huge number produced and the large number that remain available. But as condition improves, prices can rise substantially. Current PCGS price guide figures show the 1985P at roughly $1 in MS60, around $1 to $2 at MS61 and MS62, approximately $2 around MS63, about $5 to $10 around MS64, roughly $20 to $30 around MS65, around $70 to $225 around MS66, and approximately $825 to $1,150 at MS67, depending on the listed grade or premium designation. These are guide values, not guaranteed selling prices, and actual transactions can be higher or lower depending on certification, appeal, market conditions, and the specific auction. The documented auction history shows just how unusual the finest coins can become. PCGS records an auction record of $1,528 for a 1985P graded MS67, sold by Goldberg Auctioneers on June 5, 2017. NGC's auction database also records activity for certified 1985P examples, showing that this issue has attracted substantial collector attention in high grades. These numbers should never be used to claim that every 1985P quarter is worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. The ordinary circulated coin is not. Even many uncirculated examples are worth only modest premiums. The truly interesting specimens are those that climb into the highest certified grades, and there is another possibility worth mentioning. Genuine mint errors and recognized die varieties can create additional value, but those characteristics must be verified. A post-mint scratch, damaged rim, stain, or altered surface is not a valuable mint error. Collectors should be especially cautious with dramatic internet claims that assign enormous values to ordinary coins simply because something looks unusual. The 1985P is already an excellent example of a coin whose value can increase dramatically through condition alone, so there is no need to exaggerate its rarity. The strongest story is the factual one. More than 750 million were struck. Hundreds of millions are believed to survive. But truly elite examples are far more difficult to locate, and the finest known certified pieces have demonstrated four-figure auction potential. So when you look at a 1985P Washington quarter today, don't simply ask whether it is old enough to be valuable. Ask what happened to it after it left the Philadelphia Mint. Was it immediately thrown into circulation and handled for decades, or did it somehow escape that journey? Was it stored carefully in a roll or collection? Did it preserve its original luster? Are Washington's cheek and hair remarkably clean? Are the open fields free from distracting contact marks? Does the reverse display sharp detail and attractive surfaces? Has the coin been improperly cleaned, or does it retain its original appearance? These questions matter because the 1985P is not a rarity of production. It is a potential rarity of preservation. PCGS's survival estimate of roughly 271.5 million examples across all grades makes that distinction unmistakable. The finest known level currently associated with the regular strike issue is MS67 in the PCGS record, and the auction record of $1,528 demonstrates that the very best examples can be worth thousands of times more than face value. Yet the real significance of this coin goes beyond dollars. The 1985P is a tiny time capsule from an America recovering from economic crisis, celebrating a powerful expansion, debating the future of government and taxation, confronting the Soviet Union, embracing new technology, and moving toward the final years of the Cold War. It was created because American commerce needed hundreds of millions of dependable quarters, and it performed that job exactly as intended. Most of these coins lived ordinary lives and became worn pieces of pocket change. A much smaller number were preserved, and an even smaller fraction survived with the extraordinary surfaces demanded by the highest grades. That is the mystery sitting inside this seemingly ordinary quarter. It was not born rare. It became interesting because of survival, condition, and the passage of time. So if you discover a 1985P in an old jar, a forgotten box, a bankroll, or a family collection, don't immediately assume you have found a fortune, but don't dismiss it either. Examine it carefully, compare its condition with certified examples, And remember that the most valuable discovery may not be the oldest coin or the coin with the lowest mintage. Sometimes it is the coin that millions of people spent without a second thought, while one extraordinarily well-preserved survivor quietly waited for decades to be recognized. The 1985 P. Washington quarter is exactly that kind of coin, an everyday piece of American money transformed by history, survival, condition, and the discerning eyes of collectors. Next up take a close look at the 1989 D. Washington quarter, because what appears to be an ordinary 25-cent coin is actually a small time capsule from one of the most dramatic years of the late 20th century. This quarter was struck at the Denver Mint with a production total of 896,535,597 pieces, making it very clear that the regular 1989 D issue was never intended to be a scarce coin. It carries John Flanagan's familiar portrait of George Washington on the obverse, the National Eagle on the reverse, and the D mint mark identifying Denver as its place of manufacture. The coin is part of the modern-clad Washington quarter series, measuring 24.3 millimeters across and weighing 5.67 grams, with a copper-nickel outer layer surrounding a pure copper center. But numbers alone cannot tell the whole story. When this quarter was being produced in 1989, America was entering an extraordinary historical transition. Ronald Reagan had just left the White House after 8 years, and George H.W. Bush had become president. The United States was still a global superpower locked in the Cold War, yet the political landscape was changing faster than almost anyone could have predicted. In Eastern Europe, communist governments were weakening. In November, the Berlin Wall opened, creating one of the most recognizable images of the end of the Cold War. In the United States, the economy was expanding but beginning to show signs of strain, while Americans were entering a new technological age shaped by personal computers, expanding telecommunications, changing financial markets, and an increasingly interconnected global economy. Through all of this, the quarter continued its quiet job. It moved from banks to businesses, from cash registers to pockets, from vending machines to parking meters, and from one generation of Americans to another. The remarkable part is that almost nobody handling those coins in 1989 could have known that collectors decades later would examine them for tiny differences in strike, preservation, die characteristics, and condition. The 1989 D, therefore, begins as a story about mass production, but it eventually becomes a story about survival and the extraordinary scarcity of coins at the very highest grades. The reason the United States Mint needed to manufacture so many quarters goes back to the changing structure of American coinage. The Washington quarter had entered circulation in 1932, initially connected to the bicentennial anniversary of George Washington's birth, and the design created by John Flanagan eventually became a permanent part of the nation's circulating currency. By 1989, however, Americans were no longer using the silver composition associated with the earliest Washington quarters. Regular quarters had been converted to copper-nickel-clad composition beginning in 1965, a major change driven by rising silver prices and the practical need for a less expensive circulating material. The 1989 D belonged completely to this modern clad era. Its outer layers contained copper and nickel, while the center was pure copper, producing the familiar appearance and distinctive edge of a modern United States quarter. The purpose of the coin was straightforward. Commerce required enormous quantities of dependable small-denomination money. A quarter was particularly useful because 25 cents could complete a purchase, provide change, operate machines, pay for parking, or combine with other coins to cover everyday expenses. In 1989, the American economy still relied heavily on physical cash. Electronic payments existed, of course, but the digital financial world that people take for granted today was nowhere near its modern scale. The quarter therefore remained an important practical tool. At the Denver Mint, production involved the industrial preparation of metal planchets, the striking of designs under immense pressure, inspection and handling, and distribution into the national economy. Once released, these coins were not protected treasures. They were deliberately sent into a harsh environment in which millions of pieces repeatedly collided with one another, moved through bags and counting equipment, rattled around in cash drawers, and passed through countless human hands. That process explains something extremely important about modern coin rarity. A coin can have a huge mintage and still become scarce in the finest condition because surviving without meaningful marks is much harder than simply surviving. The 1989D is an excellent demonstration of that principles. There is another layer that collectors should investigate carefully: varieties. PCGS recognizes a 1989D Washington Quarter repunched mintmark variety identified as FS501. A genuine repunched mintmark can be significantly more interesting to specialists than a normal example because it provides evidence of a die-making or mintmark application characteristic rather than damage that occurred after the coin entered circulation. This is precisely where caution matters. A strange-looking mark near the mintmark does not automatically make a coin an RPM. Post-mint scratches, dents, abrasions, corrosion, machine damage, and other forms of circulation damage can create shapes that resemble varieties to the untrained eye. The same principle applies to alleged doubled dies and other dramatic-looking features. Serious collectors compare the coin with documented variety references and, when necessary, seek professional attribution. If a 1989D quarter possesses a recognized variety, exceptional tunning, or an extraordinary grade, its value can move beyond the normal range for the date. But the regular 1989D should not be promoted as an ultra-rare coin merely because of the year. Its genuine story is more nuanced and therefore more interesting. Almost 900 million were made, hundreds of millions are believed to remain, and yet the finest certified survivors can bring hundreds of dollars because pristine surfaces are dramatically harder to find than worn ones. NGC's auction database also shows that certified high-grade examples have appeared in the market, including MS69 pieces that realized prices ranging from $47 to $588 in historical teletrade sales. Those results also demonstrate why collectors should distinguish between grades, grading services, individual coin quality, and the date of an auction. A price from decades ago is historical evidence, not a guaranteed current market price. The market can change, population counts can change, and a coin's eye appeal can make one example perform very differently from another, carrying the same numerical grade. So when you hold a 1989D Washington Quarter today, the most important question is not simply, how old is this coin? The better question is, how did this particular coin survive? Look carefully at the fields around Washington's portrait. Examine his cheek, jaw, hair, and the open areas for contact marks. Inspect the lettering and the rim for evidence of damage. Turn the coin over and study the eagle and the surrounding fields. A truly premium example should have strong original luster, minimal distractions, and an attractive overall appearance. Be especially careful with cleaning. A coin that has been polished or harshly cleaned may appear bright, but can lose the original surface quality that advanced collectors want. If the coin is circulated and heavily marked, it will normally remain close to face value. If it is uncirculated and attractive, it may deserve closer examination. If it appears exceptionally clean, professional certification could determine whether it belongs in a much more valuable grade. And if you notice an unusual mintmark feature, do not immediately assume that you have discovered a rare error. Compare it with documented examples of the FS501 repunched mintmark and other recognized varieties. The greatest lesson of the 1989D Washington Quarter is that rarity has several different meanings. A coin can be common by mintage, but scarce in a particular grade. It can be plentiful in circulated condition, but difficult to find with pristine surfaces. It can be ordinary as a regular issue, yet become far more interesting if a genuine recognized variety is present. And above everything else, it is a historical survivor from a remarkable year. In 1989, George H.W. Bush entered the White House. The Cold War was approaching its dramatic conclusion, the Berlin Wall fell, Eastern Europe was changing, American technology was accelerating, and the nation's financial system was confronting serious challenges. Through all of it, this quarter quietly performed its job. It bought things, it provided change, It operated machines. It moved through communities. Most of the nearly 900 million produced were never expected to be collectible treasures. Yet decades later, a small number of exceptional survivors have demonstrated that even an everyday coin can become valuable when preservation, grade, variety, and collector demand come together. The documented $763.75 MS-67 auction result is proof that an ordinary-looking 1989 D can become a serious numismatic object at the highest quality level. So before you spend one, throw it into a jar, or dismiss it as just another modern quarter, turn it over, check the mint mark, study the surfaces, and look at the details under good lighting. You may not have a fortune, and most likely you will not, but you may have something far more interesting. A genuine survivor from the year when the old world was beginning to disappear and a new era was taking shape, preserved in a tiny piece of American money that was once worth only 25 cents. Next up take a close look at the 1994 D Washington quarter, because this ordinary-looking piece of American money comes from a year when the country was undergoing enormous political, economic, technological, and social changes. The small D mint mark tells us that this quarter was produced at the Denver Mint, and the official mintage was an enormous 880,034,110 pieces. That number immediately gives us an important warning. The regular 1994 D Washington quarter is not rare simply because of its date or mint mark. Yet there is another side to this coin that makes it genuinely fascinating to collectors. PCGS estimates that approximately 440 million examples survive across all grades, around 132 million survive at mint state 60 or better, and approximately 26.4 million survive at mint state 65 or better. At the highest levels, however, the population becomes dramatically smaller. PCGS identifies the 1994 D as one of the scarcer-clad Washington quarters in MS-66 and higher, estimating that only about 100 examples were known in MS-66 and fewer than a dozen in MS-67 in its published analysis. The condition census reaches MS-67, and the documented auction record for a PCGS MS-67 example is $1,500. PCGS.com, so this is not a story about a quarter that was manufactured as a secret rarity. It is a story about an everyday coin that entered an enormous American economy and through the passage of time became much harder to find in extraordinary condition. When this quarter was being struck in 1994, Bill Clinton was president. America was enjoying an expanding economy after the early 1990s recession. Personal computers and the emerging internet were beginning to change communication. NAFTA was taking effect, and the country was moving toward one of the most important political shifts of the decade. The 1994 D quarter, therefore, represents two different things at once. In circulation, it was simply 25 cents, designed to be spent. In a collection today, an exceptional example can become a window into an America that was rapidly entering the modern digital age. The story of why this quarter was made begins with the Washington quarter itself and the practical needs of American commerce. The Washington design had originated in 1932 when the United States Mint issued the quarter to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. John Flanagan's portrait became one of the most recognizable images on American currency, and by 1994, the design had already been familiar to several generations. But the physical composition of the coin had changed dramatically from the silver quarters that Americans once carried. Beginning in 1965, regular circulating Washington quarters moved to copper-nickel-clad construction because rising silver prices and changing monetary conditions made the old silver composition increasingly impractical for mass circulation. The 1994 D was therefore a modern-clad quarter, weighing 5.67 grams, measuring approximately 24.3 millimeters in diameter and carrying a reeded edge. Its outer layers were copper and nickel surrounding a pure copper center. NGC coin.com, the purpose of producing hundreds of millions of these coins was straightforward. Americans needed quarters. A quarter could be used for parking, vending machines, laundromats, transportation, small purchases, and change at retail stores. Banks needed huge supplies to satisfy businesses, and businesses needed enough coins to keep daily transactions moving. The Denver Mint was part of a national production system designed to meet that demand. Metal planchets entered the manufacturing process, dies struck the Washington portrait and reverse design into those planchets, and finished coins were inspected, counted, packaged, and distributed. Nothing about the process was intended to create a rarity. The mint was producing a workhorse of American commerce. The irony is that the very process that made these coins common also created the conditions that would make pristine examples scarce. Millions of coins were struck, transporting, packaged together, and eventually thrown into circulation. As they traveled through bags, machines, cash drawers, bank equipment, pockets, purses, and countless hands, their surfaces accumulated contact marks and wear. The quarter was designed to survive this treatment, but collectors eventually became interested in the small percentage that escaped it. The America of 1994 was very different from the country that had existed when the Washington quarter was first introduced. Bill Clinton had entered the White House in January 1993 after defeating incumbent George H.W. Bush and independent candidate Ross Perot in the 1992 election. Clinton presented himself as a new kind of Democrat, emphasizing economic growth, fiscal responsibility, investment, and modernization, while also supporting significant domestic policy changes. By the time the 1994 D quarter was being produced, the economy was recovering from the recession of the early 1990s. The Clinton administration's February 1994 economic report projected continued expansion, stronger employment, healthy consumer spending, increasing business investment, and continued growth in housing. The administration reported that the unemployment rate had fallen from 7.3% in December 1992 to 6.4% in December 1993, while inflation had remained relatively restrained. $1 or a few dollars in lower mint state grades. MS-64 examples can move into several dollars, MS-65 into the low tens, MS-66 into the tens or hundreds depending on the market and certification, and MS-67 can reach hundreds or potentially around $1,000 or more in strong transactions. But these are not guaranteed prices. Coin markets change, individual examples differ, and auction results can vary dramatically. A coin with unattractive surfaces may perform poorly even if it carries the same numerical grade as a beautiful example. A coin with strong luster, clean fields, sharp detail, and excellent eye appeal may attract multiple bidders. This is why collectors should never assume that a price guide number automatically represents the cash value of their particular coin. The most important evidence comes from comparable certified coins and actual recent sales. So if you have a 1994 D Washington quarter in front of you, this is the moment to slow down and inspect it carefully. Start with the D mint mark, but remember that the mint mark alone does not create rarity. Then examine Washington's cheek, jaw, hair, and the large open fields surrounding his portrait. Look for contact marks, scratches, dullness, stains, or evidence of cleaning. Turn the coin over and inspect the eagle and the surrounding fields with the same attention. A coin can technically be uncirculated and still receive a lower mint state grade because of numerous marks. Conversely, an exceptionally clean example with strong original luster can become a serious candidate for professional grading. Avoid polishing or cleaning a potentially valuable coin because altering the surface can reduce its desirability and make accurate grading more difficult. The most important point is to separate what is common from what is genuinely exceptional. More than 880 million 1994 D quarters were struck, and PCGS estimates hundreds of millions still survive. PCGS.com, so this is not a coin where simply finding the date means you have discovered a fortune. Instead, the exciting possibility is finding one that survived in extraordinary condition. The documented MS-67 auction record of $1,500 proves that the highest quality survivors can be worth vastly more than their face value. PCGS.com, and beyond the money, the coin itself preserves a fascinating moment in American history. It was created during Bill Clinton's first term, when the economy was recovering, NAFTA was reshaping the debate over trade, healthcare reform was dominating Washington, Republicans were preparing for a historic congressional victory, and the internet was beginning to transform communication. It was an era when Americans still relied heavily on physical quarters while simultaneously stepping into a digital future. That is what makes the 1994 Washington quarter worth a second look. Most examples will remain ordinary 25-cent coins, and that is exactly what they were designed to be. But among the hundreds of millions produced, a small number escaped the damage of circulation and survived with the extraordinary preservation demanded by the highest grades. Those survivors tell us that rarity is not always about how few coins were struck. Sometimes rarity is about how few remained beautiful after decades of time. And somewhere, perhaps inside an old collection, a forgotten coin jar, or a roll that has sat untouched for years, another 1994 may still be waiting to be examined under the light, carrying not only the image of George Washington, but a tiny piece of the America that stood at the threshold of the digital age.